You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm here with Felix Velarde, who wrote a book, Scale at Speed, and he's been involved in the marketing and agency business for years as well. So thanks so much for joining me, Felix. Why don't you give the origin story for why a book and why now?
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me on. Why a book? Because the stuff in it needs to be shared. Why now is because nobody still has written this book, so I kind of became time. Working kind of backwards, I did a podcast about 3-4 years ago, an interview by an amazing lady called Lucy, who asked me about my new career. And at the time, I was 3 years into a career as a serial growth accelerator for other agencies, having had a 20-year career as a serial agency founder and seller of agencies and a group CEO. Anyway, so I'd retired when I was 47 from my agency career, and I'd started helping other agencies grow really fast. And I'd built a formula really on, it was largely built on the shoulders of giants, but it was accessible and so on. And I was doing this thing, and it turned out to reliably double everybody's revenue. Every single company that went on the program doubled its revenue in 2 years. Some of them tripled, a few of them sold. And Lucy interviewed me for this podcast, and she asked me about this thing. So I have this peculiar affinity with podcasts. Anyway, somebody was listening to this interview, another amazing lady called Kate, and she got hold of me and she said, "That sounded so sensible. You won't remember me, but 25 years ago, you taught me how to do CRM strategy. And I remembered your course because I'm tall and bald. And I probably had blue hair actually when I was teaching the course." And she said, "You should write a book." So the reason that there is this book is because of another interview several years ago and somebody picking up on that and saying, "Why not write it all down?"
Great. Well, I'm sure that there will be even more agency owners very pleased that you shared the process. So in a nutshell, what's the table of contents look like with Scale at Speed?
Well, there are loads of books about how to run businesses, and most books focus on one specific thing, like how to hire superstars, or how to do strategy, how to do propositions and competitive differentiation. There are thousands and thousands of great books that are kind of single topic. And there are very, very few books that are kind of all-in-one manuals for how to grow a business. There are some classics, obviously, Jim Collins' Good to Great, and so on, which are mandatory reading for anybody who wants to lead a company and build a company. But there aren't very many instruction manuals. And I had read lots of these fantastic books, anything by Pat Lencioni and anything by Jim Collins, and Verne Harnish's Scaling Up. Oh my goodness, what an amazing book. Except you need 1,000 people to be able to implement it. And it's incredibly complex. And I'm a simple guy. I came from agencies. I ran digital agencies for 20 years. Some of them were brilliant and I got right. And some of them I screwed up and got, wrong. And then I ended up running an agency group and doing a roll-up and so on. So I had all of this amazing experience of running companies, screwing things up, learning from my mistakes and getting it right in the context of reading lots and lots of amazing business books. So the framework that Scale at Speed is the manual for is just the simplest way that I could find for getting a team to buy into your future growth without resisting the change that's always going to be required when you build or aim for future growth. And so there's a whole bunch of tools in there, like how to set goals, how to get your team motivated, who to assemble on your team, what the processes should be, how to co-design solutions, and all of this kind of good stuff. And then that's interspersed with best practice for hiring A players, best practice for creating risk registers, for doing marketing strategy, for doing value-based selling and pitch psychology and business process re-engineering, and all of these good things that are, these are known things. We know how to do them, but most entrepreneurs, when they start a business, what they know about is how to disrupt and how much they want to change the world. Very few entrepreneurs actually know how to run a business. So Scale at Speed, you asked, what's the content list? The content is everything that you need to be able to get from the point where you get stuck in growing your business. And that's usually the point where you've got product market fit, you're doing a couple of million in revenue, you've got a really, really good system, and it's optimized for the size you are. And suddenly you realize that you're not growing. And the reason you're not growing is because you're optimized for the size you are, not for the size you want to be. And so this book is the manual for how do you get past that blockage, that plateau? How do you design the next phase of your growth, and how do you use the process to accelerate that growth?
So when you your prior experience and when you initially wrote the book, it seemed like it was sort of inspired by agency specific growth planning and putting those frameworks in place in an agency environment. However, it seems like now when you actually put pen to paper, you wrote it at a more generic level. So sort of any business should be able to implement this across a service or a product or whatever. Was there a moment where you sort of thought like, okay, what I've discovered in the agency business, I can actually transform over into other businesses, right? Because obviously as an agency, you had businesses as clients and they were facing those same growth challenges, right?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, my businesses, I had one of the world's first web design companies. And, I had a series of very creative agencies, and then strategic agencies, and then a consultancy, and then a group of companies. And the group of companies was some agencies, data, research, tech companies, and so on. And I realized at that point, and this was while I was still in my kind of management leadership career, that most businesses basically run the same. And I'd joined things like Vistage, which is a great peer mentoring network thing. And I'd been sat next to the head of a ball bearing company. I had 45,000 employees. He was on one side of me, and on the other side was the guy who ran Peugeot in the UK. And then there was somebody across the table who had a publishing company. And we were all coming across exactly the same problems. How do you get suppliers to pay on time? How do you make sure that you've got enough money in the bank? How do you optimize processes? How do you retain brilliant staff? How do you get rid of disengaged staff? And all of these amazing management things that are actually universal. The things that weren't universal were my sort of standard KPIs for agencies. 55% of the gross profit is what you should be spending on staff. And if that ratio goes up to 60%, it means that you've got staff not doing anything. If it goes down to 50%, it means you've got staff overworked. Great, reliable KPIs for my industry that didn't apply to others. And then there were other things like inventory and warehousing and things that apply to other industries but didn't apply to mine. So I kind of focused when I finished that career on working with businesses. Obviously, I had a reputation in agency land. I've been one of the creators of digital. I'd been heavily involved with the people who invented the internet, and I've been around the block a few times. And so it was easy for me to get commissioned by agencies to come in and help them become their chairman and so on. But I fairly quickly realized that most of the things that I was talking to people about and teaching people and helping people with were general, broad business principles, and that I was actually doing more coaching, complex team coaching, actually, than anything else. I wasn't telling them how to do stuff. I was asking them to think about how to do stuff in their way for their business. I've never run a CRO agency. I've never run a research company, but I was working with these kinds of companies and saying, listen, if you want to improve your workflows, perhaps read this book and this book and this book and go off and figure out a way that you can use the tools in those books to improve what you're doing as a business. And that way I didn't have to know particularly the specifics of, what goes into a business. And then the book, as I say, standing on shoulders of giants, the balanced scorecard, Kaplan and Norton, Vern Harnish's Scaling Up, the Four Obsessions. None of these books were written for agencies. Execution Maximizer, which got adapted early on, was essentially drawn from Scaling Up, but was designed for a pharmaceutical company, with 10,000 people in it. So these are just business principles and psychology principles. How do you get a team to want to change the business for the better? Where you give them ownership of the change. And how do you do that? Where you ask them to design the change. And then they feel like they've got a stake in it and they won't resist it. So there are all sorts of principles like that which actually go into the book Scale at Speed, which aren't agency specific. It just so happens that I kind of am, but most of my colleagues aren't. I mean, Jim Stern, one of your industry's leading lights, well, alongside you. I don't understand his business at all. He runs conference businesses, something alien to me. But he runs the 2Y3X program for North American clients. So I think most of the principles in it are fairly universal.
Are you finding that either in your consulting practice or just from having spoken to folks who purchased the book that they wait till it hits the fan to buy the book, and they're sort of in an emergency mode when they're reading through it and implementing it? Or are some of them actually visionary enough to sort of see that they'll need it and they're getting an advanced education?
It's something else. It's a third situation. When you're growing a company, the first million, right, is you and force of will and a bit of chutzpah and a bit of, salespersonship and getting your mates around you, and you'll muck in and there are 12 of you and it's fab. And, if there's a big pitch, then you'll all work overnight and beers and pizzas, and it's great fun, right? The first million is just huge fun. Then you get to this point where you say, okay, well, we figured out that we can sell this stuff. How do we now scale? How do we grow this from 1 million to 2 million? And what happens then is you suddenly realize that you need somebody who's got a bit of experience in the room. So you probably need to go out and find an expensive head of client services or account management, right? And a head of production, perhaps, or a process and operations person. And that's quite difficult because then suddenly you're having to afford commercial salaries rather than startup salaries. And so that's quite a wrench. And then that period from 1 million to 2 million, you find your feet. You've got this new expertise. You're starting to become more process oriented. And you suddenly start expanding quite quickly. And then what happens is you perfect all of these processes and then you stall again at a couple of million, usually about 24 people. And that's the point where it gets really, really frustrating. Up until now, you've been able to invent it all. And you've been able to do it all through common sense. Yeah. And you've kind of said, okay, well, all right, I need to bite the bullet. I need somebody who's a pro in this because, we've all been doing it just because we're all capable of doing quite a lot of things, but now we need somebody who's actually an expert. Now you're at 2 million. You've got 20 odd people, 24 people. Clients are becoming demanding. And you get frustrated because you don't know how to break out of that space of the 1 million to 2 million space. And you're getting better and better at delivering in that space. And so nobody wants to change anything. Right? Because why would you change a process that works? And yet, if you want to get to 4 or 5 million, you've got to change everything. Yeah, your client who is paying you $250,000 now, that you want to be paying you $500,000 next. Actually, a $500,000 project is massively different to a $250,000 project. Different kind of management, different teaching, different different types of contract, even different deliverables, KPIs, all that kind of stuff. So you're going to have to change loads of things about the way that you work. And the problem with that is everybody's resisting the change. So the book outlines, in fact, it details, it gives you a manual for how do you build a small internal team to design the next phase of your business, and how do you motivate them such that they will drag everybody else along with them and you as you transform the business. And one of the fantastic things, one of the reasons I love delivering the program is because the owner at that point suddenly feels like they're being liberated from being the bottleneck because they've got a team of people around them. So to go back to your original question, which is, are people doing it because there's a burning platform, or are people doing it because they're visionary? No, most of the people who come to us are doing it because they're frustrated. They've been stuck for a couple of years and they just don't know what the answer is. And we know the answer. And the book tells you the answer. And then 2Y3X, which is the consulting practice, we deliver the answer as a kind of, it's scale at speed, but done for you. So it is, I find it really interesting because the other consequence of it is that we're making owners and entrepreneurs really happy just by taking away that frustration and saying, it's okay, there is an answer, here it is. And watching that transformation that happens over the first few months of starting the program is amazing. It's joyful. And it's the reason why we all love doing it.
It's interesting, you're coming at this from almost a mission-driven perspective, right? Because you don't need to do this, right? You clearly don't need to be doing this, but yet you get a joy of doing it. And so that's what's really fun for me, is to sort of see you essentially applying your own scalability, right, to the book and its principles, right? And that's why Jim is here in the United States, sort of executing against the plan for your common clients. So it's great to see, you consuming your own plan, right, or putting together your own plan to add scale to this process.
It is really interesting because we do actually run all of the processes for ourselves.
Right.
We now have companies. We've got 2Y3Xs in the Middle East and in Africa and in North America. We've even got a Canadian client, got clients in Europe. And so we all run each other's processes. So I help Jim, I supervise Jim's process. Jim helps with the Middle East's process. It's fun. That the reason that I do it is because it's actually, there's a driver for it. And it was because my early career, I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted to change the world. I had one of the first web design companies. I was doing groundbreaking multimedia stuff, and I kind of wanted to destroy the advertising industry because it was filled with arrogant dinosaurs, right? So I was going to be the arrogant young Turk coming in and disrupting it all. And the problem was I had no idea how to run a business. I'd never really been an employee. I'm not sure that I ever had a job that I wasn't fired from before I started my own companies. and so, I started this agency, this web design company in '94, and made the whole thing up as I went along, on the basis that, but we don't need old models because this is a new world and we're creating, digital and virtual, and all of this is brand new. What can they teach us, right? The arrogance of youth. And for the first 10 years, I had no idea what I was doing. And everything was a learning experience through trial and error, everything. And I made I look back and some awful mistakes in terms of managing people, and awful mistakes in terms of managing the business's finances. And, I made some colossal errors of judgment. And I wish I had access to the tools that I eventually learned through trial and error, and through eventually finding some kind of humility and asking for advice. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book, aside from Kate and Lucy and their intervention, but one of the reasons I wrote the book was, I've seen a lot of management books and business books, and quite a few in the advertising and digital worlds, which are lists of things that you need to pay attention to, but they don't tell you how to solve them. Any fool can tell you that you need to get people management right, and that you need to get risk registers right, and data rooms and all the rest of it. Almost nobody actually tells you how to do it. So I wanted to write a manual that was a how-to guide, so that somebody could read it and say, do you know what? This is a great start. I can make a start on this. I can get on with it. Because that's what I wish for myself. So the reason I do it is because it's wonderful to see the transformations of people, but the driver for doing it in the first place was because I didn't have it when I was growing up as an entrepreneur.
Right. Well, I'm sure the list of people that are grateful about that are growing every day as the book gets purchased, and as they use the 2Y3X plan, potentially with the help of one of your team. So one thing that's changed in the last, year and a half with regards to the agency business is obviously this work from home explosion. And, it sort of changed the staffing dynamic, right? So, there's definitely a difference in the way we're hiring now than the way we were hiring 2 years ago. There's this inherent sort of tug of war behind, like, particularly in the creative side of the business, that you get some dynamic from being in an office together, right? But at the same time, some people have a preference for working from home, and also you have to sort of leave yourself the option of recruiting, remotely, simply because of the staffing shortages in the industry of people who actually know what they're doing. The really great people in particular, right? So has that sort of changed your perspective on sort of the HR chapters of the book, of how one would execute?
Well, it's interesting because the book came out in Audible format and in Kindle format a few weeks ago. It comes out in paperback on the 26th of September in the US, and you can get the paperback in the rest of the world already. So there was certainly I added a chapter into the book on emergency planning and crisis management, because there are some derivatives of the Scale at Speed frameworks and tools that work brilliantly in a crisis, it turns out. My own business has been fundamentally changed. We run monthly workshops with a growth lab team in every client that we work with. We're doing workshops the whole time, and we had to transition pretty much overnight to running, 8-person workshops on Zoom. Now, what's really interesting is that it did change the dynamic slightly, in that when you're running a workshop, and I'll port this to then how this applies to the wider world shortly, but when we're running workshops, one of us has got to facilitate, and we're trying to pay attention to 8 other people, 8 attendees' reactions. Now, when you're in a room, that's really, really easy. You've got loads of bandwidth. When you're in a Zoom situation, or sort of 2D, if you like, you don't get that bandwidth. You can't have side jokes. There's no sort of reading each other's minds and signaling for a coffee and stuff like that. So it becomes extremely focused. And what we found was that meetings and workshops became much more efficient, less colorful, less funny, less humane, actually, but much more efficient. And for us, efficiency and effectiveness is what we're about. We are doubling. Our clients are paying us a hell of a lot of money to guarantee to double their revenue, right? And that's a big thing. So the more focus, the better. So for some things, for getting things done, this has actually been a boon. This remote working. Now, but I miss that humanity. I miss that sort of the human connection, and the fact that, so I had the last day with a client where I'd sold them for a ridiculous amount of money, pretty much on the last day of the 2-year program. And so my last day with them, I went in and saw them because they're 25 miles away from here. And so we met outside on a sunny day in a pub to do this full day workshop. And that was when I realized that you miss the kind of the side channels that are constant when you're in a room of people. You know, the running jokes, the passing things to people, the whispered asides, none of which can happen in. But the other effect was interesting. When you're on Zoom, you have to make certain that you're understanding everybody correctly. So it's actually very difficult to misinterpret if you're doing it right. You know, if I want to find out whether or not you've understood me, the only way for me to know that is not through osmosis and guessing because you're sat next to me. It's by saying to you, did that make sense? Do you have any questions about it? What do you think you heard? Yeah, I have to confirm. So it's almost a consent thing. It's almost you're explicitly asking consent to move on, explicitly asking, have you understood? And everything becomes very open. And provided you've got good facilitation, a good team of people who share values, then it can actually create an additional level of communication and clarity, which can be much more effective than doing it in a sort of a relaxed face-to-face environment. So there are kind of pros and cons. Coming back to your question about HR, yesterday I offered a job to a new marketing manager for the European business, 2y3x business. She is going to work remotely. I think she's a superstar. I have no idea how tall she is. But then I've got no idea how tall my colleagues are in the Middle East because I've never met them. And yet we're business partners. We share a business together. I haven't seen Jim for, 2 years. And what's happened is we've found a different way of being able to rely on each other. And that is by focusing on the personal human values of the people concerned. So instead of relying on chemistry and pheromones of being in the office and whether you like somebody or whether they don't make you enough cups of tea or whatever it is, right, that you make judgments about people, we spend a lot of time in 2y3x and in the last 15 months with the clients that we work with, establishing the personal values of the people who are in the room. And the reason that we do that is because when we know that everybody shares some core values, we can rely on their behavior under certain circumstances. So the core values that is shared by every single person in the whole of the 2y3x organization, whether it's Africa or Middle East or Belgium or Santa Barbara, is honor with a secondary of empathy. And so I know that under every circumstance, even if people will make mistakes or get it wrong or do it differently to the way that I would do it, they will behave in an honorable way. Now that creates greater trust than if I only knew them by being in the office together. And I find that really interesting. That was a very long answer, and I'm not even sure that I gave you the answer.
I think you did. It was one of the elements of the answer that I was processing as you were saying it was the change in meeting dynamics, right? And I have noticed that some people, depending on whether or not this is a pre-existing group that has some history, perhaps in person or not, there's an attempt to replicate some of those dynamics depending on the platform it's on. So for example, in Zoom, I have noticed that some people really gravitate towards those back channel chats, right? So they're actually doing that more in a Zoom environment than they would be able to if everyone was in the same conference room, right? And they almost feel empowered, right, by the fact like, oh, I'm private messaging so-and-so, and we're having a separate conversation, right, as the sort of publicly viewable conversation is going on. And I'm wondering if that becomes permanent, right, will that really change the dynamic of meetings? Because you have these sub-meetings that potentially are going on. And currently Zoom, for example, only allows there to be a one-on-one chat, right? I can see the platforms potentially allowing you to create almost like a Microsoft Teams team of people who are having a separate sub-conference, right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, so something that I was discussing with one of my colleagues yesterday, and in fact, it was about this, the new person, our new colleague who joins us, actually joining us on Monday, so it's very exciting. And I say joining us, I mean, she gets an email address and I will see her on Zoom more. Right. Is that she's a different generation to my generation. And for her, and in fact, one of my other colleagues, you know, they've grown up with instant messaging and multi-channel comms going on the whole time. And I haven't. You know, people say in my user manual on our Notion sort of homepage for the internal staff handbook stuff, they told me I had to do a user manual for Felix. And one of the things is, what are my preferred communications channels? And I basically said, if you want it done, hit me up in email, then I'll prioritize it. Anything else becomes signal to noise, and I can't do. They're of a generation that's grown up with digital. You know, I was one of the generation that invented digital, not grew up with it by any means. And so they'll have different ways of dealing with things. And we're going to have to learn to play nicely and be tolerant of each other's natural spaces and natural ways of doing things. And I'm very mindful that this is a very fast transition from the old way of doing things suddenly into, video conferencing has been around since, I don't know when, the mid 1980s, right? It's only now that it's like, oh, look, tipping point. 2 years later, we're now wondering whether or not the natural conclusion of this particular transition isn't going to be virtual reality, which has also been around since the late 80s, waiting for an excuse to become real. And this could be it. This, if we all had a headset and technology that worked, then we might actually decide to move wholesale into virtual rooms. And in virtual reality, you might be able to flick between 6 different rooms that you can be in all at the same time, with back channels, with all the digital ways of doing things. And that would be fascinating, because that adds yet another dimension to the whole thing.
Yeah,
we haven't had until now.
Right.
Scary, right?
And exciting, absolutely. I think, my objective is not to become a dinosaur, right? To try to, understand how the new generation is interacting with the technology differently than I am. And some things, I just won't get, like watching my kids watch other people play video games, right? I mean, for me, that's just a head scratcher, right? But they're like, no, it's like watching a show or a movie. It just happens to be somebody else playing a video game.
Well, there's nothing different to that with that from you watching a football match, right?
Exactly.
Other people putting on padding so you don't have to.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So, well, thank you so much, Felix, for joining me and brainstorming about the future and how to apply scale at speed now so that you can have a bigger, better future.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is brilliant. How enjoyable.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in the Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.